Good afternoon and welcome to Glasgow and to this insurance and long-term savings section of the Green Horizons Summit. It's a great pleasure to be here in partnership with the Green Finance Institute and the City of London Corporation. My name's Hugh Evans, I'm Director General of the Association of British Insurers, and I'm delighted to be here today with four leaders of our sector who are going to reflect on what we've learned from COP26 so far, talk about how our sector can play a more meaningful role in tackling climate change and building a more sustainable future, and also think about some of the choices that face our customers and how we can work with them to help design a better world. Our format today is to have a 15-minute conversation with the President of the ABI, Barry O'Dwyer, to reflect on some of those themes, and then to join three CEOs who are going to engage with some of these themes as they reflect for their own businesses and organisations. Barry O'Dwyer, President of the ABI, CEO of Royal London Group, an industry veteran, if I can say that, 32 years in the sector. What are your reflections on how the sector is working together now to tackle climate change? And in particular, when you think about the experience of the ABI roadmap, the sector-wide framework that we published earlier in the year?
Yeah, well, Hugh, I think it's pretty obvious that the insurance industry has a direct interest in helping people to promote resilience and also to manage the effects of the physical effects of climate change. But wider than that, we also have the fourth largest long-term savings market in the world here in the UK. And so we will play a big part in helping people make responsible choices about how they invest their pension funds, for instance. So it is a fiercely competitive industry because we act on behalf of consumers in managing their lives day to day. But this has been an area where I think it's been easy to promote collaboration because everybody gets it. The whole industry is committed to making some real change. We've obviously signed up to the 2050 net zero commitments, but we've also gone further than that. We were very, very keen that we set shorter term horizon commitments so that we can hold the current generation of management to account for delivery, not just promising delivery from somebody else.
And those 2025 targets that I think are in the ABI roadmap, what practical effect do you think that has for a CEO like you and your board when you're engaging with the choices, both for the short term and for the medium term?
Well, it has a very real effect. We spent a good deal of time in the last 12 months working on, like many other companies, working on articulating our purpose clearly. And climate change, addressing climate change was a central part of that, probably in a way that it wouldn't have been for previous generations of management. So it has taken a good deal of senior executive time and board time thinking about how do we promote responsible investment across our company, but also how do we get that message across to our customers.
Let's talk about investment. You said correctly, obviously, this is the fourth largest sector in the world. I think ABI members have nearly £2 trillion in assets, many people's pension savings that they are the custodians of. When it comes to investing that money in the long run in a more sustainable way that helps fuel a more sustainable economy, what is the balance between what providers like you can do, what regulators need to allow, and what governments need to do to actually enable a sustainable sort of flow of investable assets?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because it is going to require collaboration across those three that you mentioned, the industry, the government and regulators. Because to a large extent, a lot of these assets, the 1.6 trillion that the industry looks after, that they were built up under a different regulatory regime when we had different priorities. And as a result, they're in products that are structured differently, regulated differently, have different attitudes, for instance, to liquidity and illiquidity, different concepts around what's reasonable to charge, which seem a little bit outdated in addressing the challenge that's ahead of us now. So it is going to take a concerted effort and real collaboration across government, regulators and industry to get ourselves into a position where we can make some real change and invest that money in a different way. Now, we have to be cognizant always of the promises that we've made to customers. So where we're making investments to back guaranteed returns, we have to invest that prudently and cautiously. But there are opportunities to flex with our customers, to encourage our customers to invest differently. And I think the government is alive to that, because you can see it through the Treasury review of the Solvency II regime. You can see it with the work going into productive finance and the construction of the long-term asset fund concept. So there is a lot of work there and a lot of positive intent, but it does require a great deal of collaboration, probably more than we've seen previously.
Yeah, it does indeed. I mean, obviously, one of the findings of the Treasury's interim report on Solvency II back in the summer was that the regulatory regime for UK insurance and long-term savings companies is, I think the phrase was, not aligned with public policy objectives on green investment. From what you've seen and the engagement you've had with both the government and regulators on this, are you an optimist or a pessimist in terms of whether some of these reforms are going to come through that will enable the sector to fulfil some of its ambitions?
I think I'd have to be an optimist, but I mean, you can be pessimistic about how long it takes sometimes, but we have to get there, because you know an independent assessment of the 1.6 trillion that I talked about earlier, an independent assessment looking at our sector figured that 900 billion of that could be put to use in productive finance, and that, by some measures, is about a third of what the UK needs to invest in order to give effect to the sort of the transition that we need to get to net zero. So we have to get there. I think it is, though, going to be incredibly challenging at times, because we are moving from an old way of thinking and an old way of regulating and an old way of legislating to a brand new world where we have to think possibly in different timescales than we've thought of previously. And that's a challenge for everybody.
Indeed. Well, particularly as Solvency II was framed in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. So
exactly.
I think it bears the hallmarks of that. For those sceptics who are watching this broadcast and thinking, this is the insurance industry, are just going to greenwash everything, put a bit of a nice facade on everything to try and get us off your backs, what would you say to some of those sceptics, some of the people who've been marching here in Glasgow today, about the level of good faith that is in the sector and how it can help persuade people who may be sceptical that it's actually going to do some of the things it's promising to do?
Yeah, well, look, I think everybody can understand where the sceptics are coming from. And it's not just scepticism directed at our sector, it's scepticism directed at capitalism and at business. And I think that comes back to this idea that maybe businesses and governments have been thinking on a much shorter term horizon than the activists would rather. And actually, I think they have a point. But the great thing about our industry is that we systematically think long term. You know, we take on liabilities for 30, 40 years, and we invest then to meet those liabilities. I think, you know, with some changes to the way that we look at how we manage risk and how we perceive risk, in other words, we factor in risk to the planet and risk to the climate, as well as the sort of the conventional risk-return equations that we all do. I think we can make some serious change, and we can start to show the sceptical outsider that we really do mean business. And coming back to what I said earlier, some of those shorter term targets were specifically designed to do that, to make sure that it wasn't just me and my counterparts promising on behalf of our successor, but actually that we were taking action that we could be held to account to in the next few years.
Sure. But there's a challenge there, isn't there? I mean, you know, these are not necessarily people who are going to plough their way through company accounts or necessarily believe middle-aged people in suits telling them that they want to save the planet too. I mean, there's quite a challenge for our sector, isn't there, given the traditional sort of stereotypes and barriers between, you know, the leadership of our sector and many of the sort of younger people in our community.
Yeah, and look, I'm certain that we won't always get the communication right, but that shouldn't stop us actually taking the action that we need to take. So, you know, there has been a focus on climate disclosures, but to be honest, some of that is quite confusing and very detailed. Now we're moving to a more standardized disclosure regime and a new taxonomy, and hopefully that'll make a difference, make it easier to look through companies' statements, to measure exactly what's going on in a consistent way across companies. And I think that will drive action, because what gets measured gets done.
Yeah. And how we measure is going to be one of the key challenges, you say, isn't it? At the moment, we have an inconsistent set of frameworks, inconsistent within countries, never mind across jurisdictions. So that's going to be a key challenge. Can we talk briefly about the sort of fiduciary duties? Because you, like every other CEO of a major company, have duties to the people who've invested their money with you. How much of a conflict is it on a day-to-day basis, or when you're making some of these strategic decisions, to reconcile your statutory fiduciary duties to look after the financial interests of the people who've invested their money with you, at the same time as trying to make progress on climate change and sustainability issues?
It is a real challenge. And part of the challenge there is actually getting our message across to customers that there's no point in us helping them to invest, to generate great returns on their pension assets, only for them to retire into a world where they're struggling to have reliable sources of food or reliable heating of their homes, etc. So we've started at Royal London, we've started changing the discussion that we have with customers about what they're trying to achieve. We talk about protecting their standard of living in retirement rather than generating the best return, making it clear that the standard of living is much more than just the size of their pension fund. And that has resonated very, very well with customers. People do get it. You know, nobody wants to invest their pension fund in a way that destroys the planet. What actually probably hasn't been so obvious to people is how they can invest their pension fund for good. Now, we have taken some action to tilt some of our default funds towards low carbon investments, but within the fiduciary duty that we've got and within the deal, if you like, that we have with our existing customers. But we think as we increase the volume on the discussion with customers and make more sustainable options available to them and talk to them about their responsibility to invest their pension fund in a way that looks after the planet, as well as our responsibility to do what we say. You know, we talk at Royal London about being mutually responsible with our customers for delivering that standard of living. Sure. And I think that message is resonating.
Because the Make My Money Matters campaign, I think, has estimated that the power of a pension fund can be 21 times more impactful on an individual's carbon footprint than giving up meat and not flying, both of which are pretty tough choices for most of us, I suspect. Yeah. So how far do you think people are on the journey when you talk to your customers and sort of read what they say in focus groups and so on? How far do you think they are on the journey of beginning to understand the potential power of their pension pot?
It's quite interesting, actually. When you speak to customers, then you do get this. I recycle everything that I can. I buy local food and clothing, and drive less or buy an EV or whatever. So people are actually trying to do the right thing. And I think it's amazing when you introduce the power of their pension, that it's almost like a light bulb comes on and people realise actually that there was this aspect of their life that they hadn't really thought but has a huge amount of power. So I think we're pushing on an open door with that conversation. Also, I think the industry can use different examples. So for instance, on the general insurance side of our industry, how can we help customers understand why we would want them to get their car repaired rather than having it replaced or something that is damaged, having it repaired rather than replaced. And there are lots of examples across the industry, both on the general insurance side and in the long-term savings side, where we can nudge customers towards understanding where they can have an even bigger impact.
Cool. Well, those are themes we're going to explore in the second half of this session. We're nearly out of time on this part of the session, but I wanted to ask you before we finish, what are your reflections on this week's events at COP and the balance of debate? And what do you think success looks like for our sector over the next few years in terms of the issues we've been talking about over the last 15 minutes?
I think, it's good to get this sort of injection of optimism, which inevitably comes with the focus of the world being on COP, and I suppose everybody sort of reminding themselves of some of the challenges. But we have to make sure that persists once everybody leaves Glasgow. And some of the challenges that you were referring to, I think we've got a big challenge in trying to figure out how do we create investable assets that people can put their pension scheme into. And that it comes back again to collaboration between government, regulators and industry, because we're talking about some very serious amounts of infrastructure that we need to build with very long tail paybacks. And it's not naturally investments that would be made in the past by the private sector, but you can see from everything that has been said this week, the reliance that we have on the private sector is huge. So we need to work together to try and create those investable assets for the future.
Good. Well, that's something we'll talk about in the next session. In the meantime, Barry O'Dwyer, President of the ABI and CEO of Royal London Group, thank you very much.
Thank you.